Hello, APES students. This is Chapter 18, Conservation of Biodiversity. You have these slides on the e-board, but I figured you might like a video to go along with it. So, here we go. So in Module 59, the sixth mass extinction, you should be able to explain the global decline in the genetic diversity of wild species. You should be able to discuss the global decline in the genetic diversity of domesticated species, identify the patterns of global decline in species diversity, and explain the values of ecosystems and the global declines in ecosystem function. So when we're talking about conservation, why is this coming up? Well, because we're experiencing global declines in the genetic diversity of wild species and in a large magnitude. So if you look, 50,000 species are becoming extinct every year, and that's 1,000 times higher in the past 50 years than any time in human history. So it's pretty alarming. But some declines in genetic diversity have natural origins. If you recall to Chapter 5, we talked about the bottleneck effect and how that can limit some of the genetic variation just due to only some members of that population surviving, having some traits that were left over from the larger group. This can also happen with the founder effect, where some part of that population, that big population, moves on and colonizes a new area, so they lose some of the greater group's genetic diversity. But the bottleneck effect is going to be more prevalent here as to the natural causes. So what's so good about having a high genetic diversity anyways? Well, it leads to a resilient population. If you have more genotypes, you may have more phenotypes, and that could lead to higher adaptability, resistance to a disease that might be taking out parts of that population because now there's variation. So it's quite good. If you have low genetic diversity, what you might actually end up with is an inbreeding depression. With that, you get a lot of these recessive mutations that are able to actually present themselves showing up in the populations, and that can be pretty bad. One of the examples of this, actually in humans, is with the royal family in England. They were inbreeding to some degree, and hemophilia, one of these recessive mutations, was actually showing up. And hemophilia is not a great thing to have. It makes it so that your blood doesn't really clot, so you continuously bleed from cuts. Not something that anybody really is looking forward to. So with high genetic diversity, right, that is definitely a benefit for adaptability and is going to help if there's a change in the environment. If there's some large change in a food source or just in temperature, there will be variation so that that population can endure it. So along with the fact that we are seeing global declines in genetic diversity, we are also contributing to that through some of our domesticated species. Right? The livestock, some of our planted crops, these are things that we are honing in on a specific type of crop or livestock, and so they are more susceptible to diseases and other things that might be affecting them. So half of the breeds of livestock that existed in 1900 are now extinct, and 43% of those remaining are currently at serious risk of extinction. And again, if there's some kind of disease that is going through, there isn't the variation to protect them. So of the 200 breeds of domesticated animals that have been evaluated in North America, 80% of the breeds are either declining or already facing extinction. Not so good. The nations of the world have recognized the problem of declining seed diversity and have responded by storing seed varieties in specially designed warehouses to preserve genetic diversity. So they actually have a warehouse with, I believe it was 700,000 different seeds that they're preserving just in case anything goes wrong. But as we saw with the monocropping from the agricultural chapters that we are changing our crops to be only genotype, and that can again lead to some of these issues with disease. So when we're talking about all the different species and them declining, definitely we want to know which ones are more at risk than others. So we've come up with a few labels to help us to target things that need the help that, well, they need right now. So threatened species, according to the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN for short, species that have a high risk of extinction in the near future. So these are things that are definitely not going extinct super soon, but they're definitely at threat of it in a nearer future than some of the other things. Near threatened species then are ones that are almost into that threatened status, right? They are likely to become threatened in the future. And then lastly, we've got the least concerned species. These are species that are widespread, abundant, and really don't need much facilitating to continue to thrive. These are things like the skunk, right? Skunk is doing just fine where it lives. So if we take a look at what things are being most affected, you can see that birds and mammals definitely have a little bit of an issue with 13% of birds being threatened, 25% of mammals, but the big one that is really at risk are amphibians. We talked about how amphibians are a great indicator species in previous chapters, reason being that they live in freshwater and land environments. So if either one of those is having some disruption, some kind of construction project, more recreation, something that is disrupting their life cycle from the tadpole all the way till they get to their frog or toad state, that's going to harm them. So they are more threatened than the two other ones shown here in the pie graphs. So when we're talking about ecosystems, we want to talk about the values that they have. And there's two ways that we can do that. So there's the intrinsic value and the instrumental value that ecosystems have. So for the intrinsic value, this is more of a moralistic view of that ecosystem. It's a way that we can say that this place has value, but not necessarily because we use it, just because it exists and we should keep it there for moral sake. Instrumental value is the actual goal or tool use of that ecosystem. So for example, a forest might have a ton of trees that you use to make paper and other paper goods. So that would be the instrumental value, right? It's instrumental in helping you achieve some sort of goal. Whereas again, that intrinsic is just saying, hey, this is a forest, it's been here forever, it deserves to be here. So when taking a look at that instrumental value, we can say that the ecosystem has quite a few different services that it provides, and each ecosystem will benefit humans in one way or another, and that depends on really what it is. So there are 5 categories that we are going to talk about. First one is provisions, then you've got regulating services, support systems, resilience, and then cultural services. So for provisions, what are provisions? Well, they are a good that humans can use directly. So going back to that forest being used for paper, right? This is that lumber. You can also get food, crops, medicinal plants, natural rubbers, anything that we are using or using to, right, achieve that goal for that instrumental value. This would be that provision. So of the top 150 prescription drugs sold in the United States, about 70% come from natural sources. For the regulating services, what are those? Well, natural ecosystems help to regulate environmental conditions. The natural ecosystems such as tropical rainforests and oceans remove carbon from the atmosphere through sequestration, right? The trees are going to grow, they're going to take in all that extra CO2 that we are emitting, so that can definitely be a regulatory system. And ecosystems are also important in regulating nutrient and hydrologic cycles. We also saw that when you have an area of woods or any vegetation, it's going to help water return to the groundwater beneath rather than run off and go right into the ocean. We also saw that there was a test done where they cut down a forest or part of a forest next to a very, very healthy part and saw that in the area that it was completely clear cut, there was nitrogen and all sorts of other nutrients running with the water that also was now run off out of the area. And that was leading to, well, all those nutrients going somewhere. Ecosystems also provide support services. So what are those? Well, natural ecosystems provide numerous support services such as pollination of food crops. They can also help with the purification of water, and they can supply habitat for predators that prey on agricultural pests. So these are things that would be extremely costly if we were to try and spearhead them ourselves. Why do that when the ecosystem can do it for you? We've also talked about resilience in the past. That's the ability to bounce back from some negative impact to that environment or ecosystem. And so resilience is also a great thing to have, right? That means that if there is going to be some disturbance, that it will, over time, bounce back to what it was. And this greatly depends on species diversity. If you have one particular thing in an ecosystem and that gets some disease and gets knocked out, well, the entire thing crumbles. So if you have a lot of species diversity, then you're going to end up having many different things that can maybe take some of the parts of that role and help out. So for example, several different species may perform similar functions in an ecosystem, but differ in their susceptibility to disturbance. If a pollutant kills one plant species that contains nitrogen-fixing bacteria, but not all plant species that contain nitrogen-fixing bacteria, the ecosystem can continue to fix nitrogen. And so that is a very nice thing to have, having that ability for other things to help out and take over, and that leaves these ecosystems more able to provide all the other benefits that we've just talked about. Lastly, there are the cultural services. So the awe-inspiring beauty of nature has instrumental value because it provides an aesthetic benefit for which people are willing to pay. Look at the national parks. Everyone likes going to the national parks. Why? Well, because they are awe-inspiring, right? You go to the Grand Canyon, you go to Yellowstone, you go to all these places that just have ecosystems that are thriving and very interesting, and that is, well, very valuable to us, right? People love to go and see these places. Similarly, scientific funding agencies may award grants to scientists for research that explores biodiversity with no promise of any economic gain. Unfortunately, there is a decline in ecosystem services. So of the 24 different ecosystem functions, 15 have been found to be declining or used at a rate that cannot be sustained for the future. If we want to improve ecosystem functions, we need to improve the fate of the species and ecosystems that provide these services. Moving on to Module 60, Causes of Declining Biodiversity. After reading this module, you should be able to discuss how habitat loss can lead to declines in species diversity, explain how the movement of exotic species affects biodiversity, describe how overharvesting causes declines in populations and species, understand how pollution reduces populations and biodiversity, and identify how climate change affects species diversity. So as we mentioned with amphibians, they definitely are more prone to their environments being disrupted, and with that disruption of their habitat, they are going to be more at risk. And this is, across the board, the largest cause of declining species diversity. So for most species, the greatest cause of decline and extinction is habitat loss. Most habitat loss is due to human development, so us building malls, us creating different landscapes, maybe building on the wetlands so that we can get some more seaside housing. Things like that are definitely going to contribute to declining species diversity. Species requiring such specialized habitats are particularly prone to population declines. Again, with that wetlands, that is not a huge part of the environments we see across the US. If you are taking out the wetlands, you're taking out a lot of the things that are specialized to live in the wetlands, and they don't really have anywhere else to go. So, huge issue. A species may decline in abundance or become extinct even without complete habitat destruction. We can see here a map of habitat loss in terms of forests, and if you look at the United States, we're doing pretty well. Increase in forest cover, which is that kind of minty looking green. You can see that all across the US, we're doing quite nicely. And this is from 1980 to the year 2000. But if you look at South America and parts of Africa, even Indonesia, there's a large decrease in forest cover. You can see, especially in South America, large swaths, mostly for paper goods, have been cut down, and that is definitely leading to some of the issues with habitat loss for a lot of the species that rely on the forest. Habitat loss is also an issue in marine ecosystems, where coral, which is kind of like a tree in that sort of environment, right? It's an area where a lot of fish are going to group around, organisms are all going to be living on that, feeding around that. It is a huge staple of those coastal reef environments. That is declining. If you look at this graph, you can see that there is a sharp decline, especially from the late 70s all the way until 92. And it continues this downward trend all the way till 2012. So not very good for something that is a staple of a lot of these ocean environments. So another anthropogenic cause is overharvesting, which is again going to cause declines in populations and species. So hunting, fishing, and other forms of harvesting are the most direct human influences on wild populations of plants and animals. Most species can be harvested to some degree, but a species is over-harvested when individuals are removed at a rate faster than the population can replace them. And as we saw from previous chapters, this is certainly happening with the oceans, right, where overfishing is leading to a lot of problems due to a tragedy of the commons, and those populations just can't reproduce fast enough to meet the demand of those fishermen. In the extreme, overharvesting of a species can cause extinction. Another issue is with exotic species that are moving around. Native species are species that are going to be living in an area for thousands or millions of years, things that have lived in that area for a long time. These exotic species are things then that are moved to these areas, and they are not within what we would consider their historical range, where they've been for a long time. Once it develops in that area, if it takes a large hold, it doesn't really have predators, it can become an invasive species. This is what we see with the stink bugs that right now are on the East Coast. They were brought into Pennsylvania in, I believe, the early 90s. They were a small pest, and at this point they are now a full-blown invasive species, attacking apple orchards and all other cropland, and they really don't have anything that feeds on them or disrupts them too much. So they are blowing out of control. Of course, they're thinking about bringing in a wasp species to try and counteract them, but as we saw with the cane toads, every single thing that you bring in could have another effect. So they're worried very, very much so about another invasive species coming in, disrupting something else, and having a chain reaction. So these are definitely things to worry about, right? If you're moving around the world, even accidentally bringing a pest with you, such as the zebra mussel, which was in the ballast water of ships from Asia, came over, poured that ballast water in, and now you have zebra mussels everywhere. These things can be very serious. Now, sometimes with the invasive species, these are accidental, but certainly sometimes things are not so accidental, and people do move species because they want to for certain reasons. So the legal and illegal trade in plants and animals represents a serious threat to their ability of some species to persist in nature. So if you are taking, especially if it's a threatened species, and taking some of its members to become pets, or perhaps even some of their parts are being used as herbal remedy, this can definitely lead to some issues for that already hurting population. So national and international laws do help to protect those species though. The Lacey Act, which is a U.S. act that is prohibiting the interstate shipping of all illegally harvested plants and animals, is really looking to stop trade between different states, right? Interstate shipping. So this is looking to make it so that anything that lives in a particular area is not taken out of its natural habitat, it doesn't spread, and it also doesn't have its regular populations dwindled due to whatever reasons. And then there is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. This was a 1973 treaty formed to control the international trade of threatened plants and animals. And again, a lot of plants and animals are being brought to different areas just for, pets, like tigers and all sorts of turtles, just things that people find interesting or that are hard to get. And so this is in place to try and help avoid some of the damages that can do to these populations that are not doing so well. Now, if species is threatened, it will be on the red list. So this is something that you can look up on your own. You can look up a whole bunch of the different threatened species. Just type in red list on a Google search, it'll come up with everything that exists. And so this could be anything from the Bengal tiger to what is that turtle? The green sea turtle, I believe, a loggerhead turtle. There's a whole bunch of different species on that list that are threatened. So aside from hurting the populations by taking some members and moving them from one place to another, what else could be an issue? Well, pollution definitely has harmful and widespread effects on species depending on what it is. So threats to biodiversity come from toxic contaminants such as pesticides, which wash in from agricultural land, heavy metals, acids, and oil spills. All of those we've talked about in the past and definitely have led to some bad situations for populations that live in those areas. Other contaminants such as endocrine disruptors have also had some pretty bad effects, non-lethal ones, but ones that could be affecting reproduction in odd ways, right? Making some male fish take on more feminine characteristics or disrupting the egg laying of females. There's all sorts of things that these endocrine disruptors can do since they're working with their hormones. So it can lead to some very dangerous situations for things that can't escape those disruptors. Pollution sources that cause declines in biodiversity also include the release of nutrients that cause algal blooms and dead zones, as well as thermal pollution that can make water bodies too warm for species to survive. So it's not just these toxic contaminants, it's also environmental things such as the lack of oxygen from the algal blooms and also the lack of oxygen from thermal pollution. So on the topic of changing temperatures, climate change has the potential to affect species diversity. If a climate change affects patterns of temperature and precipitation in different regions, biodiversity may be threatened. Right? Things like to live in specific ranges of moisture, specific temperatures. If you change those things, they might not be able to adapt and might end up just being threatened or even extinct. So, for example, in some regions, a species may be able to respond to warming temperatures and changes in precipitation by migrating to a place where the climate is well suited to the species' niche. In other cases, this is not possible. This is especially true for plants. If they can't spread their seeds to areas where the seeds will grow and thrive, then that plant is going to die out. If you are a bird, for example, then you definitely will be able to fly from that area and you have the mobility to find somewhere where you're okay and you can find the food that you're looking for and the temperatures that make sense. But anything that is not fast moving, that does not have that mobility, is definitely going to be at more risk. This leads us to Module 61, Conservation of Biodiversity. So after reading this module in the textbook, you should be able to identify legislation that focuses on protecting single species, discuss conservation efforts that focus on protecting entire ecosystems. So those are the two big points. Conservation legislation often focuses on a single species. Marine Mammal Protection Act was in 1972 and was mostly looking at the two species of the sea lion and the otter. Now the otter specifically is a keystone species, especially up by Alaska, and so if that is disrupted, that can lead to a whole ecosystem collapse. In terms of other protection, there was the Endangered Species Act, which we had just talked about in the last module. First passed in 1973, it authorizes the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to determine which species can be listed as threatened or endangered and prohibits the harming of these species. Trading these species is. It also authorizes the government to purchase habitat that is critical to the species. This has led to some controversy because if the area that they inhabit is a place where others would like to have construction projects or use for other activity, well, now they can't. The government says, no, this habitat is needed, it is critical to the species, you cannot do XYZ to the land, and so there is some pushback with some who would like to benefit from for whatever they are looking to do. Our government isn't the only party that is interested in maintaining biological diversity. The Convention on Biological Diversity was an international treaty to help protect biodiversity. The treaty has three objectives: conserve biodiversity, use biodiversity sustainably, share the benefits that emerge from the commercial use of genetic resources. In some cases, conservation efforts need to focus on protecting entire ecosystems. So there are sometimes hotspots that are, well, full of value and they need to be fully protected. They need to be completely protected from any destruction, any disturbance, so that the ecosystems can thrive and that biodiversity can be sustained. So protecting entire ecosystems has been one of the major motivating factors in setting aside national parks and marine reserves. In some cases, these areas were originally protected for their aesthetic beauty, but today they are also valued for their communities of organisms. The amount of protected land has increased dramatically worldwide since 1960. So if you take a look at this graph, you'll see that the area, which is in millions of square kilometers since 1900, has increased dramatically, almost exponentially if you look at that curve. So up to 2000, you can see that there are many different areas or types of areas that are well protected. So for protected areas, the question is, well, how far do you protect? So the size, shape, and connectedness of protected areas is a large factor into, well, how we put aside this land. So although the theory of island biogeography was originally applied to oceanic islands, it has since been applied to islands to protect areas in the midst of less hospitable environments. For example, it is less likely that species can travel among protected areas that are far apart. When a species has been lost from one ecosystem, it will be harder for individuals of that species from other ecosystems to recolonize. Conservationists must also consider meta-populations. A species is more likely to be protected from extinction if it can be rescued by dispersers from a neighboring population. So making sure that those two can still interact with each other, or that they can interact with each other, is extremely important. Edge habitat is habitat that occurs where two different communities come together. This is exactly what we're talking about with those meta-populations. Typically, this is going to form an abrupt transition, such as where a grassy field meets a forest. The biosphere reserves, or the areas that are going to be protected, are going to consist of zones that vary in the amount of what people can actually do there, what we're going to call permissible human impact. So, at the core of this, the area that you're really trying to protect, you are only allowed to observe that which is within it. And you can see that with those two deer around that one lake. Then there is the buffer zone, the outer area that is still slightly protected, just to make sure that there is a buffer space, right? Something to make sure that there's extra space for them to wander and live. There's really only recreation, tourism, and research. Nothing that's going to cause a great damage to that ecosystem. Then the transition area is going to be where you can start your logging, your farming, and your human settlements, right? This is an area outside of that area where you're no longer confined to only certain activities. But this is far enough away that you are not disrupting whatever species or ecosystem that you're trying to preserve. So biosphere reserves ideally consist of core areas that have minimal human impact and outer zones that have increasing levels of human impact. And again, the whole point of this is to give enough space to that reserve so that you're not coming in, disrupting it, even though you think you're within a zone that shouldn't be disrupted. That sums up Chapter 18, and I hope that you stay around for Chapter 9.